On March 22nd, 30 nations, the United States, Canada, the UK, and the 27 member nations of the European Union imposed Magnitsky Sanctions on officials and entities responsible for the genocide currently taking place against the Uyghurs. In recent years, similar sanctions have been imposed against officials from Russia, Myanmar, Belarus, Saudi Arabia, and other countries for violating human rights and for massive corruption. As the world has taken an authoritarian turn in recent years, we are hearing more and more of these sanctions. So, as many of you are now wondering, what are Magnitsky Sanctions, and why are more and more countries applying them? Do these sanctions actually make a difference, or are they purely symbolic? Magnitsky Sanctions get their name from Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who was brutally murdered in prison for investigating massive corruption committed by oligarchs and those friendly to Vladimir Putin. In response to his murder, and thanks to the efforts of Bill Browder, the investor who hired Sergei Magnitsky and whose firm was the victim of said corruption, the US Congress passed the Russia and Moldova Jackson-Vanik Repeal and Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act of 2012, which has come to be known as the Magnitsky Act. The US imposed the first sanctions under this act on Russian oligarchs in 2012. They came to prominence during the Mueller investigation when it was revealed that Russian agents lobbied the Trump campaign to overturn the US's Magnitsky laws in exchange for dirt on Hillary Clinton. So how do Magnitsky sanctions work? The conventional means of punishing a country for acting in an unlawful manner in the past was to impose economic sanctions against the entire country. This type of sanctions is currently being imposed on Iran for their development of nuclear weapons. The problem with such broad sanctions is that they hurt the well-being of innocent civilians of those countries just as much, if not more, than their despotic leaders. They should be considered a last resort. It's the economic equivalent of carpet bombing. Magnitsky sanctions, by contrast, are like using a guided cruise missile to specifically punish economically those responsible for human rights atrocities and acts of corruption. The punishments involve seizing foreign assets, banning travel to the country, and preventing corrupt actors from engaging with businesses based in the sanctioning country. These sanctions work because they remove the privileges corrupt officials enjoy in wealthy countries, such as living in attractive cities and storing their wealth in more secure Western institutions. Oligarchs prefer to spend their holidays in places like Saint-Tropez instead of Sochi. These sanctions can be made even more effective by targeting the family members of corrupt officials, as unlawfully acquired funds are frequently funneled through them. In addition, their children often attend prestigious Western universities. For instance, Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard. It should also be evident that it's hard for these authoritarian regimes to retaliate in kind, as few politicians or officials in Western countries engage with companies based in the offending countries or yearn to travel within their borders. This is very much a one-way street. To illustrate what can happen to a sanctioned official, consider Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong. She is the one responsible for turning Hong Kong from one of the freest places in the world into a police state, and is now, under the Magnitsky Act, sanctioned by the US. In consequence, she can only receive her salary in piles of cash, as all of her bank accounts have been frozen. Magnitsky sanctions also weaken the power base that supports dictators and authoritarian regimes. It's important to note that no dictator rules alone. They can only rule with the support of, at the very least, an inner circle. CGP Gray's video, Rules for Rulers, does a great job of explaining this concept, so go check it out after you've watched this video. If too many members of this elite inner circle start to suffer because of the actions of their leader, they will start to oppose or even look at overthrowing the dictator. Currently, 30 countries have implemented legislation modeled on the Magnitsky Act, though the European law only applies to human rights abuses and not cases of corruption. Several other countries such as Australia and Japan are currently debating implementing their own version of a Magnitsky Act. The more countries that implement Magnitsky legislation, the fewer places there are for corrupt money and corrupt people to hide, making such sanctions even more effective. However, have the sanctions actually worked in practice? In terms of upsetting authoritarians, the answer is overwhelmingly yes. Putin has, at every turn, tried to undermine Magnitsky sanctions or intimidate countries into backing down. The Chinese Communist Party, when its officials were sanctioned for the Uyghur genocide, retaliated with its own sanctions against British, European, and Canadian parliamentarians. Clearly, facing sanctions is a big deal for them. There are also signs that these sanctions discourage these regimes from committing brutal and oppressive actions. Andrei Sanikov, a Belarusian politician and activist, attributed both his ability to survive in prison and his eventual release to the fear Belarusian officials had of getting Magnitsky'd. Okay, but have Magnitsky sanctions actually overthrown any oppressive regimes? No, or at least not yet. Regime change usually requires several interacting and mutually reinforcing causes, and the ones that are ultimately effective aren't usually revealed until after the fact. In addition, Magnitsky sanctions are usually the first of possibly several measures taken to get an authoritarian regime to back down or to undermine its power apparatus. If an authoritarian government persists in its corrupt and criminal behavior, the next move can be to escalate the application of sanctions to organizations, industries, and finally entire nations. It's unlikely that determined and powerful regimes will collapse solely as a result of Magnitsky sanctions. All of this, of course, assumes that Magnitsky sanctions are widely applied and properly enforced. Unfortunately, powerful authoritarian regimes can intimidate countries, especially smaller ones, into not enacting Magnitsky legislation or not imposing Magnitsky sanctions. This is why it has taken such a long time for countries other than the US to impose sanctions against Chinese government officials. In addition, some countries like Canada, even though they had enacted Magnitsky legislation, lacked proper intelligence gathering and coordination to properly enforce these sanctions, though apparently now this problem has been recognized and is being addressed. For these reasons, it is crucial that countries work together and share best practices when imposing Magnitsky sanctions. It would be an understatement to say we live in chaotic times. We as civilians see these atrocities happening around the world, and it's easy to feel helpless, as if there's nothing we could do. Magnitsky sanctions are one way for accountable governments to say to corrupt officials who pillage their countries and to the monsters committing crimes against humanity, "We may not be able to stop you, but don't imagine there won't be consequences." Hi everyone, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please like it and share it. When it comes to fighting corruption and human rights abuses, there are many organizations to choose from. For this episode, I'm going to focus on the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which supports the Uyghurs who are suffering from perhaps the worst human rights atrocity taking place on this planet right now. So please consider supporting them at the link in the description.